Everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Emma Amon, and I'm the Senior Communications Coordinator for the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. One of my jobs here today is to troubleshoot any tech issues that you may encounter. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please reach out during in the chat box below. Today's webinar will start off with a presentation from Stephen Gaetz, the President and CEO of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and then we'll move on to a question and answer period. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we will get to them after the presentation. Off to you, Steve. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you everyone for showing up. Really looking forward to sharing some of our knowledge and what we're learning about preventing youth homelessness. So I'm going to move to sharing my screen now, and we'll go from there. Okay. There we go. Okay. So we're going to, as you know, because you're all registered for this, we're going to discuss 5 program models to prevent youth homelessness in Canada. I think one of the things that we've seen that's been a big change in the last 5 years in Canada and the United States is a greater interest in not just dealing with the emergency that is homelessness, but what can we do to prevent it from happening in the first place. So we'll be going through some of this. We'll start with the problem we're trying to solve. And here I'm going to be drawing on what research evidence around youth homelessness, and you'll see why it matters in terms of the different programs that we're going to be talking about as we go. So we did a national study on 2 occasions. In each case, over 1,200 young people filled out surveys, and we got some really interesting results. And this is one of the pieces of information that I think is, for me, was the most shocking in a way, and that is that 40% of all currently homeless young people had their first experience before they were even 16 years old. And the characteristics of that group, if you look at the side there, you can see the characteristics of that group is significantly distinct from those who had their first experience when they were 16 or older. More likely to experience multiple episodes of homelessness, to be involved in child protection, to be victims of crime, to be tested for learning disabilities, etc. And so this is important to know from a policy perspective, because in most jurisdictions in Canada, for this group, we do nothing, right? Our homelessness services start at 16, 18, or some cases 21. In some places, there may not be any services. And many people think, well, child protection takes care of these things, but it's not designed to help prevent youth homelessness. A second piece of information, this is about child protection. In Canada, about 0.3% of young people have had some kind of involvement in with child protection. Amongst young people experiencing homelessness, it's 58%. So that's exponentially larger, and that suggests that there's a pipeline into homelessness from how we handle homelessness or how we handle child protection. 47% were apprehended and had either wound up in foster care or in group homes. And what happens in many cases is that when people age out, they are young, they may have lots of assets, personal assets, but not enough money to pay for rent in this market. I don't think I have to explain the challenges around living independently, but it's really hard for young people because they're generally not poised to earn enough income to do that. Mental health and well-being, this is really important. Sean Kidd, who's internationally one of the most renowned researchers on youth homelessness and mental health, helped design the questions for the survey. And we found that 85% of all young people would be in the high symptom distress category, which if they were in housing, we would expect that they'd either be in inpatient or outpatient care. So that's important. And in terms of criminal victimization, this is key too, that we often frame young people who experience homelessness as people that we should be afraid of. You see it a lot in the media now with concerns around things that happen on subways. People experiencing homelessness get framed as being dangerous or criminals or a threat to us for random violence. But the reality, the research shows conclusively that if you're young and homeless, you're exponentially more likely to be a victim of all kinds of crime. We found in a previous study that 38% of all young women reported being raped in the previous 12 months while they were homeless. And that's unacceptable, right? It just, the trauma that comes from being a victim of crime can be quite long lasting and disabling. Exploitation and sex trafficking, nearly 1 in 5 young people from this study by Covenant House reported experience of being trafficked, mostly for sex trafficking. And part of the challenge is our public institutions, whether it's group homes or homeless shelters, sometimes are unwittingly creating access for predators and pimps who will go into the shelter, often with their proxies, posing as young people who are homeless in order to recruit. So it's essentially we're warehousing young people, and there's a big neon arrow on the roof that says, here they are, come and get them. And so there's a lot of problems that come with our well-meaning response to homelessness. And then finally, the research on what happens when young people exit homelessness shows that it's often very difficult. If we don't provide the right supports, young people live in extreme poverty. They're not recovering if they've experienced trauma. They're not re-engaging with education or employment. They're not overcoming social exclusion. And so as a result, many return to homelessness. And so all of this is important. And I won't read this slide because I hate when people read slides, because you can have a look at it. But there's a lot of lessons learned by this, right? The harm that comes from prolonged exposure to homelessness is quite significant. And we maybe wait too long to intervene. We're not providing the right kind of supports. We rely on an emergency and crisis system that was designed for adults. But I keep wondering, can't we do more? And I think we can. So we're working here on the issue of youth homelessness prevention. We believe that we should be focusing on prevention for all people experiencing homelessness, but there's a particular case to be made for young people and the need to help and support them. The government of Canada, with Reaching Home, did something that had never been done by the federal government in Canada, and they started to point to the need to prioritize the prevention of homelessness. And so these are mandatory community outcome areas for the government of Canada. So communities are required to report back on these things. And if you look, 2 of these things here are focusing on prevention, right? So can we reduce the inflow into homelessness? That'd be fantastic. And can we have fewer people return to homelessness? And there's interesting research emerging that shows that when young people exit homelessness, they're more likely than adults to return to homelessness. Other information that we have from the government of Canada that suggests a need to focus on youth is the fact that through their national point in time count, they identified that of all people experiencing homelessness, 50% had their first experience before they were even 25. And I'm going to show you this next slide here, which is interesting in terms of data. This plots the age at which people are experiencing homelessness for the first time. And if you look here, where the arrow is, between 12 and 20, that's when it seems most people are having that first experience, between 12 and 20. That's a big surprise. But it suggests something in terms of policy. If we want to prevent homelessness, if we want to impact on chronic homelessness, if we want to reduce chronic homelessness, we need to do more in this area, because if we could help young people avoid homelessness in the first place, help young people and their families, and focus on well-being, not just whether someone's housed or not, we likely would have a very positive impact on those young people and their families, but also would likely have a long-term contribution to the reduction in chronic homelessness. So I believe if we address youth homelessness well, we're actually engaging in the prevention of chronic homelessness. So defining the prevention of youth homelessness. This is important. If you have a problem, you have to understand what you mean and what you don't mean. And to put it simply, this is an updated version of what we're trying to do with prevention. The first is to reduce inflows into homelessness, so to stop people from becoming homeless in the first place, or intervene really early in their homelessness, so that they can exit right away. The second is to reduce the transition to chronicity. So if someone becomes homeless, we should be paying a lot of attention to helping them exit as quickly as possible before they get entrenched or experience trauma or other problems that make it really hard to get out of homelessness. So our system should be geared to do that, right? We should be using shelter diversion and other kinds of supports to help young people not become homeless. And then finally, reduce the returns to homelessness for those who have exited homelessness, right? So we saw from what I said earlier that young people don't do well when they exit homelessness. We have to do a better job, and we can. And so in having a definition like this, we have to also focus on what homelessness prevention is not. So things that we do while people are homeless can be really well-meaning, helping get ID, cooking classes, employment, readiness training. All of those things are important, but they're not preventing homelessness because the person is and continues to be homeless. Now, in thinking about prevention, we need to think about who is responsible and where are the opportunities. So typically, the responsibility for ending homelessness lands on the homelessness sector, right? So services and supports, drop-ins, day programs, shelters and community entities have been given this responsibility to end homelessness. And I think that's where we're kind of missing the boat and letting some parts of government and society off the hook for responsibility. We describe homelessness as a fusion policy issue, which means that it touches on many of the things that governments do, provincial governments, federal governments, municipal governments. So it's not just a housing issue, although it most certainly always is a housing issue. It involves health, justice, education, family supports, mental health, child protection, all of these things, and human rights. And so if we want to really prevent homelessness, we're going to need a whole of government approach. It can't just be down to programs, that kind of thing. They're key because that's the intervention on the ground level. But we also, as part of that, need to think about what's necessary to prevent homelessness. And so we have a typology of youth homelessness prevention. That slide didn't roll out very well, but anyway, that involves 5 different things, right? So structural prevention would be things upstream like income supports, more access to affordable housing, addressing discrimination, addressing our horrible history of colonialism and racism against Indigenous people, these kinds of things. Systems prevention would be things like, we talked about young people involved in child protection. Like that sector contributes to the production of youth homelessness, as does the criminal justice system, as does our healthcare system, where we discharge people into homelessness when they're not ready to recover or able to recover. Early intervention programs, here's where we're going to talk about some examples when I get to the 5 approaches. And crisis intervention is so early intervention is working farther upstream. When young people are at risk of homelessness, crisis intervention is right at that point when people are experiencing homelessness or new homelessness. What do we do? And then finally, stabilization is how do we help people exit homelessness, never to return again? So we've been working with communities across Canada on a big project called Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. It's a partnership between Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home Canada. And what we're trying to do is develop the knowledge and build the techniques for supporting communities and governments to address homelessness through prevention. It doesn't mean stopping the other things that are so necessary, including emergency shelters, that kind of thing, but it means adding to our toolkit prevention. And so we're doing a number of things. Like one of the things we're doing is we've funded 39 different research projects on youth homelessness prevention across Canada. That's probably the largest investment in research on youth homelessness that's ever happened. anywhere. We are also doing demonstration projects, which involve, funding community organizations to test out things that, and then, as we test, learn, and adapt, and modify, and as we go, we'll develop knowledge about how to do this work. And as part of this work, we're doing research and evaluation. So we want to find out, like, how do we know it works? Like, is it really preventing someone's homelessness? Is it improving their life? And so this brings us to our key program models to prevent youth homelessness in Canada. All of these things we have been testing and working through with the Making the Shift project and our many community partners across Canada. So I'm going to give you some highlights about how they work. The whole purpose here is to help people think about, like, are these things you could do in your community? Are these things that you'd like to try or you'd like to learn more about? Are these things that your local organizations could use some help in implementing? Recall that the Government of Canada wants to see outcomes in terms of reductions in homelessness, and anybody working with youth wants to see reductions in youth homelessness, definitely. What can we do to help stop it in the first place? So the good news is we have a lot of knowledge that we've developed on this, things that are ready to go, things that we've been testing, things that we've been doing research on. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is these 5 things. These are all things that would be interesting to test in your communities or go with. They're ready for scaling because we've developed the knowledge on them. So I'm going to go through them. The first is enhancing family and natural supports. And by natural supports, we mean chosen family, other adults in a young person's life who could be influential and also be there for the long run. Professional supports are important, but they're always going to be short term. And one of the things that's interesting, like when I used to work in the homelessness sector, this was like a very clear thing, is that when a young person leaves home, the family kind of disappears from the picture and is often seen as the problem, and we have to protect the young person from their family, based on the reality that many young people come from households where they experienced abuse and neglect. But the reality is that not every adult in a young person's life was necessarily harmful or dangerous or a problem for them. And so the question for us is, how do we help young people connect to family? How do we help families so that they can work and be supportive of young people? How do we try to remove the conflicts that can lead young people to feel they have to leave home or to be kicked out? And so there's been a lot of work done in this area. We've had 8 different projects looking at enhancing families and natural supports. So when we did research, that research I told you about before, we asked people about their interest in re-engaging family, and it turned out that a fair number already were engaged with family, but 77% they said they'd like to have improved family relationships. So, and that they recognize that that would be important in terms of their long-term goals and that kind of thing. So the underlying ethos of the work is, that we feel that meaningful adults in a young person's life are really, and the supportive, caring adults is important to everyone. It is to me, it is to anybody. And so why wouldn't it be for the young people that we're working with? So we've learned a lot about how to do it, and there's training available on how to implement this. Through the research, we've actually come to conclude that whatever you do, whether it's prevention work or working with young people who are currently experiencing homelessness, or young people who have exited homelessness or exited child protection, we should be offering up the opportunity to strengthen the supports of young people to their families. So this is one of our program model guides that you could read if you're interested in learning more. The second thing is about school-based interventions here. And this is a really important thing to think about it. If you think about it, every young person who experienced homelessness or who experiences it was in school at one time. It's the institution that young people spend their most time engaged with. And very often a young person might share with a teacher or a counselor or a coach or a piano instructor that they've been having some problems at home. But the challenge is that schools aren't designed to support the prevention of homelessness, and teachers often don't know what to do, or the school doesn't want them to get involved, that kind of thing. And so we're missing an opportunity there, because that's also where people are when they're 12, 13, 14, all the way up to 18. And if we could really get into the schools, we have a chance to really do something. And so what we're wanting to do here is to not say, here's another thing for schools to do. Schools, it's your responsibility. You have to figure this out yourself. You have to end homelessness, because that won't happen. What we really need are school community partnerships, right? And so Youth Reconnect is a good example of that. It's about keeping young people in place in their community. And Mike Lefby, who many of you may know, runs the Raft in St. Catharines, and he tells this story that's really compelling, where he was with the Raft. They had a homelessness shelter. They started with 8 beds and then added more till it was like 14, and then added it till it was 24, and they couldn't add it anymore because the building had no room for it. And so it occurred to him that what if we, rather than wait for the young person to go through all this, they come from Fort Erie and they move to, they couch surf for a while until there's nowhere else to go, and then they move on, wind up in Niagara Falls, and then wind up in St. Catharines. And a lot of bad things can happen along the way. And so his suggestion was, why don't we go to Fort Erie and work with the schools there and stop young people from becoming homeless? And that coincides, by the way, with an approach in Australia where over 20 years ago, they put in a Youth Reconnect program nationwide. And so how it works in these cases is the partnership is this. The Youth Reconnect program staff go in and make connections with the schools, talk to the principals, talk to the teachers. They'll do a big student assembly and talk about what it means to be homeless and what you should do if you're having problems with your family. They'll do the same with the teachers. They build the relationships. And then when a young person starts to experience challenges, they know where to go. But also teachers can refer and talk to the young person, say, you know what, I know you're struggling here, but it would be great if you want, we can connect you to the Youth Reconnect worker, and they might be able to help you and your family. And the program works from there, right? So the school does not see this as a burden that they have to do something else, or teachers like, oh my God, I never signed up for this. This is helpful for the schools, right? Because what you want to do with school-based interventions, you want to focus on stabilizing, keeping young people in their communities, connected to family and meaningful adults, connected to friends. You want to address what the problem is and stabilize the situation. You want to support not just young people, but also their families, right? Because there could be things on either side that are a problem. And you want to keep people engaged in school, right? The dropout rate when young people wind up homeless is really high because it's really hard to stay in school. So the whole goal here is to really build supports around the family. Now, another school-based intervention, this is number 3, is the Upstream project, which also comes from Australia. And what they've done is they've created this system that adds a few steps along the way. So the first is they do a universal screening. So every young person in a grade or 2 grades or in middle school fills out a survey. Based on the results, students are flagged, and then the intervention happens. And what's important here is that many of the young people who are identified through the screening, the teachers have no idea. Because sometimes young people in those crisis situations double down and school becomes their safe place. So they fill out the form. It looks at both strengths, but also challenges for young people. And they're looking to see who's at risk for homelessness or dropping out of school or criminal involvement. And the way it works at the practical level in the school is that in terms of consent, they use an opt-out method. So rather than have parents say yes, sign a form saying, okay, I'll have my student, my child participate, it's opt-out. So parents can still have the ability to say, no, I don't want my young person involved in that. But the difference is dramatic. When you have the opt-out where young people just can do it and parents don't say no, the participation rate is usually over 90%. Where if you have the opt-in, it's less than 15% typically. And it's not because parents are signing in saying, I don't want them to do it. It's because a lot can happen between handed a form at school and fill it out and bring it back on Monday, and it gets stuffed in the backpack and is a crumpled mess that parents might see 3 months later. You have to do it this way, and it's important. And what happens with Upstream, and there's an absolutely amazing version of this, by the way, in Kelowna, BC right now, but they survey all these young people, and ideally you focus on middle grade students. So this allows you to get to the young people who are 12, 13, 14, who are at risk, those ones that may be experiencing homelessness for the first time. And what they find with this research in Australia and in Canada is that over a third of young people show up on the spectrum of risk. Over a third. And so what happens next then is that we don't just take the results of the survey as the only way of looking at this. We then do a further interview and assessment. We learn from the teachers what they think. The teachers will talk with young people, see what they need, see if they want help. They're offered help. It's not forced on anybody. They're offered help. And then based on that, there's a 3-level model of support. So for some young people, it's just kind of a light touch approach. Keep an eye on things, check in with the young person every month or so, see how things are going, all the way to more intensive support for the young person and their family. And the results from Australia show that they've driven down the rate of youth homelessness. It's great because you get to those young people early. It's early intervention. It's good for the young people. It's good for the family, and it's good to keep them connected to school. So there's more to learn from this. This is our program model guide on this one. And then Housing First for Youth. This is program intervention. You can tell from the name, and it's adaptation of the Housing First program, which was developed for adults, chronically homeless adults with mental health and addictions issues. We redesigned it in Canada, working with organizations in Calgary and Hamilton, working with young people with lived experience to answer the question, what would it look like if we designed a Housing First program that was developed to meet the needs of developing adolescents and young adults? And so we have like core principles of Housing First for Youth, which mean that young people should have access to housing and support, which might mean going back home, by the way, not necessarily a new apartment. No preconditions, no conditions that you have to attend school or that you have to abstain. We really build it around helping young people make their own decisions and choices. We take a positive youth development approach, which means not just focusing on what's wrong with young people, but building up their personal assets and resilience and recognizing that young people, even when they come from dire circumstances, have lots of strengths and lots to offer. The supports are individualized, and we really focus on social inclusion and community integration. So the range of housing options are like this. It can be, particularly for younger people, it wouldn't make sense to put a 14-year-old in their own apartment. And it's also landlords aren't going to lease to someone 14-year-old, but there are other options, including transitional housing. They may return home. You keep in touch with them, you support them, and the goal is that eventually they will move out like any young person. And if it's like any young person in Toronto, it usually means with other friends, that kind of thing. So we know a lot about the housing side, but here's the key thing. The focus of the supports is different from the adult version. There's housing supports, of course, but this focus really is on well-being and social connection, social inclusion. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to what does a young person need? Like, not what does a young person experiencing homelessness need, but what does any young person need? What did you need when you were 14, 15, or 16? If you have kids, what do they need? That kind of thing. And so we want to support young people, but have them be in charge of their own journey and help them engage in school if that's what they want to do. We want to help them develop the skills to live independently. Most young people who wind up homeless have never had a lease or how to take care of a house. So how do we help them? And then the social inclusion piece is really important. And so these outcome areas drive the work. We want to look beyond just, are they housed or not? We want to make sure they get what they need so they can thrive. And it isn't just about making them independent adults. In fact, no, we want to build them like me. I'm an adult, but I have supports. I'm engaged in a web of support. So that's what we want to do with young people. Now, as part of our research, we have done 3 pilots here. One applying Housing First for working with young people who are currently homeless and helping give them the supports to stabilize their lives when they exit. The second is an early intervention approach. So it's about working with young people who are leaving care, child protection, right? And recall the figure about how many young people have been involved in child protection and how the pathway from child protection to homelessness for many is pretty profound. Housing First for Youth can be used as a response to those problems around transitions from care. You can do that in any community. And then Ndi Young is an Indigenous adaptation of Housing First for Youth that focuses on cultural connection and reconnection, on ceremony, and on imbuing all the supports and case management with Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. So using 7 grandfathers' teachings, the circle of courage, these kinds of things to really build young people up, make them feel valued, make them feel included, make them feel connected. And it's just an exciting approach, right? That shows what we can do for young people. So in terms of results, I'm going to just show you a very brief scan of the results. So with the Housing First models in Toronto and Ottawa, we did a randomized controlled trial. So half the youth received Housing First as an intervention. The other half did not, but they may have had other kinds of housing interventions, that kind of thing. And we wanted to see the results. How well does this work? We're tracking people for 48 months, right? So 4 years to see what happens over time, because the research from At Home Chiswa, the research on Housing First for Adults, shows that that recovery takes time and that changes can be slower than you expect. And when you double on to that, the idea that we're talking about developing adolescents who are on their own path and growing older, we shouldn't expect like huge results in the first year, but we do have some interesting results from the first year. So this is around educational outcomes. And bear in mind, this happened during the pandemic. But if you look at the middle post there, right, the middle columns, at the start, when people entered the program, 40% were involved in education, going to school, which is consistent with our broader research on dropping out amongst young people experiencing homelessness. After 12 months, 72% were in school, right? And you can compare this with the blue columns at the right, which show that the young people who were getting treatment as usual did not have the same outcomes. Now, here's another thing: employment outcomes, really good gains for young people, including those in the treatment as usual group. But we saw more engagement in employment, which is interesting because, again, that was during the pandemic. Quality of life, we're starting to see some minor gains. They're not, in every case, statistically significant. If you look at this column here, this is the Housing First for Youth group. This is at baseline when they started, and this is after 12 months. Improvements in mental health. So that's pretty impressive. And then resilience, we're seeing some gains. It's starting to go up. So we'll know more in the next couple of years once we've analyzed the other data, the 2, 3, and 4 year data, to see what really happens. Okay. Now, duty to assist. So Excuse me for coughing. I've been talking a long time here. So duty to assist is, to me, one of the most exciting innovations that's happened in the world of homelessness, perhaps the biggest one since the invention of housing first. And this comes from Wales, where in Wales, they introduced a piece of legislation almost 10 years ago. And the legislation was to take a rights-based approach to homelessness. So when the local authority, the local government, the municipal government became aware that someone was at risk of homelessness or had just become homelessness, there was a duty, to take reasonable steps to remedy the person's homelessness. And so what this meant in practical terms was that in 2 days, or sorry, in 2 weeks, they needed to offer the person assistance. And if the person accepted, they had 2 months to resolve the situation, which didn't mean get them into shelter. It meant addressing their homelessness. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm going to get some water here. Okay, I'm back. It's allergy season. So this is what they've done in Wales, right? And so it's basically everybody who they become aware of who's experiencing homelessness. The first response is, let's fix this. Let's invest in making sure you don't become homeless. And look at this graph here that shows that the levels of homelessness, of new entries into homelessness, kind of fell off a cliff once they instituted this, right? And it's one of those things where you sit back and go, wow, that makes such sense. Let's help people right at the beginning, put in an effort to stop them, making sure they don't become chronically homeless, and see what happens. And so the question for us became, could a duty to assist be adapted in the Canadian context? Could it be used to address youth homelessness? And so the starting point for considering how to do something like this is, how do people access help? How do we design a system so that people know where to go for help and they receive help that is designed to make sure they don't become homeless? And so we, Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory, we work with this human-centered design company called Bridgeable. And so they're experts in working with systems and figuring out, like, from when you put a person at the center of a question, figure out what they need from their perspective, you'll get better outcomes than if you sit back and go, I figured out a good way to, make this thing work. You need to go to people and find out what they think and what they need and what are their pathways. And so the human-centered design approach was really key to our thinking about this. Put that person at the center, that person with lived experience. What is their experience and what do they think would help? And this is very enlightening when we think about how to address youth homelessness, because if you think about it, no 14-year-old wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go to City Hall and see if I can get some family mediation support, because, first of all, they may not consider themselves experiencing homelessness or be at risk, but they also may not know that there's anything there to help them. And if they're 14, the reality is there isn't. And so what do young people do, right? Do they go to the homelessness sector? Do they go to a shelter? No, they don't. The first thing they do is they'll tell their friends, right? That's the first point of contact, but they might also tell the friend's parents or family, like that kind of thing, neighbors. They might talk to teachers or counselors at school, their relatives, faith leaders. You notice on this list, this is all people that they're connected to in their community for the most part. It's people they know, people they have relationships with, people who work for institutions that they know well, right? And so that's where the point of assistance must come from, because they're not going to go to City Hall. if we could figure out a way to embed support within these public systems, we could have a big impact on homelessness. And so one of the areas we decided to do work on was the schools, because based on what we know about school-based early intervention. So pathway mapping is really important to think about here, right? So as we said earlier, like young people under 16, there's no support infrastructure there for them, but there are schools, there are doctors and nurses, there are coaches, instructors, this kind of thing. Another thing is that in our research, 2/3 of young people who are currently homeless don't consider themselves to be homeless, right? So many are not going to go to the homelessness sector for help, right? That's just not something that they would consider. So young people aren't going to reach out to the infrastructure that we currently have in place that we expect is designed for people experiencing homelessness. They will approach the infrastructure that's in place to help young people. And so that's how we should build a support model, right? So it should be teachers, instructors, all of these people I've been talking about. How do we equip them to help the young person without making them responsible as social workers? And this is where it goes back to community school partnerships, right? If you have something like youth reconnect style programs in your community, and they're connecting with schools, but could also be connecting with community centers, local healthcare providers, that kind of thing, then those people who know something's wrong will know where to go get help. And so this is kind of the way we look at it. So, if you have this in place and you have a communication strategy, so people are aware that help is there, and then, some young people will, refer themselves to the thing. They'll go and get help. They'll find out where it is. There's lots of good ideas about how to do that communications effort. You support teachers, counselors, and other staff. So you help them understand homelessness, help them understand what kind of questions to ask, and also help them know where to point the young person. So the young person goes and gets connected, accesses support, is offered support, which they can turn down, right? But at least they're offered that. And then if they agree to support, they get a wraparound experience that involves working with their family, if that's what they want, and if that's what makes sense, but basically is working to keep the young person in their community. And there's such interesting examples of how that can work, and the cross-fertilization between all 5 of these interventions. We learned recently about this program in Minnesota where when young people couch surf and go and stay with their friend's family, often the family is like, you can stay here as long as you want, but doesn't have support. And so what if you had kind of a host homes program where you're not taking somebody to a stranger's house, but you're helping the young person stay with their friend's family or the local neighbors, that kind of thing. So there's lots of innovation that could be tapped into this kind of program. If we were to really try this one out, we've tested all the other ones, but this one we had a pilot we were planning to do, and the pandemic showed up. But this is one we have a lot of faith in, that this could be game changing if you built your system locally around the idea that anytime someone presents as homeless, that instead of pulling them into the shelter system, except for like a day or two, we work really hard to give them supports and their families the supports to help them stay in their communities and to work on the challenges and work towards having them thrive. So our planned rollout in terms of testing this out was to start with the education system, but also then move on to other public systems that young people are involved in to see if we can help people in those situations who contact and are engaged with those public systems to get the help that they need, including faith community, employment services, those kind of things which you might not think of. So implementing preventive program models. It's a challenge for people because we have not prioritized this in Canada until very recently. And to really make this go, you need policy and funding aligned to support prevention. Community organizations receive funding, but you don't want to put people into a situation where there's an opportunity cost that in order to fund the prevention program, they have to drop close the emergency shelter, because that change will never happen. We need the knowledge base about how to do prevention, and that's what we've been working on with our partners, and evidence for the efficacy of it, the effectiveness of it. We need that, and we need to build the capacity of local governments, upper orders of government, the not-for-profit sector, to support moving in this direction. So to get there, there are challenges, right? Because it's a change management exercise, right? It's asking people to think about the problem differently, think about the solution differently, and apply new ways of doing things. And one of the things we found is that in one of our demonstration projects on Youth Reconnect is the staff who were formerly working in the emergency shelter were now working in the community with families. They loved the change. They loved being able to work with the 13, 14-year-olds. It was a type of work that was fantastic. So this isn't, going to eliminate jobs or anything. It's going to create new jobs that are better jobs. A question it's interesting to think about for everybody who's listening in here is, where would you be at, or where would you like to get to in terms of knowledge around these things? Have you heard of any of these kind of things before? If you have, do you want to learn more? Do you want your organization to get support around thinking about, does this help the organization meet its goals? Have you adopted or implemented preventive interventions? What is your interest level in this? And we want to hear from you on that, right? So that's important as well. So we want people to move up, ideally, so that we start to see more preventive interventions across Canada, share the information, highlight it so that people can see that we can do things in this new way. If people are interested in finding out more, there's lots of resources on the Homeless Hub that explains these kind of things. But the key thing is that for most people, it's like you can read a document, but at some point you want to talk to someone about it, right? Because you'll have questions that the document doesn't answer. And so one of the things that Making the Shift has been working on, this is work led by Away Home Canada, is around training and technical assistance, right? And so we've been developing capacity to help community organizations, local communities, interested parties to actually implement, to learn about these things and test them out and see if this is what they want to do, to see if they're ready for it, if they want to do it and need help. And the training and technical assistance usually doesn't it's better if it doesn't just involve like a one-shot training session, because what happens is you can look at the documents, that's great. You can get training from people who've actually done these interventions, that's great. But once you're actually doing it, there'll be questions that come up that you're like, wow, I never thought about this. I don't know what to do. And so the technical assistance part is key. You need someone to talk to that will help walk you through those sticky bits. We organize communities of practice so people doing Housing First for Youth can talk to other people and troubleshoot and share and build on each other, their knowledge, that kind of thing, and then and build community so people don't feel alone, that they're the only organization or only person doing this work in their community, that they're connected and supported as long as possible. And then there are also free online training and resources on the Homelessness Learning Hub. And then finally, if you're interested in filling out a survey to help us understand your interest in or your needs as an individual or organization, you can go to this URL down at the bottom, a bit.ly one. It's a short one, so you can write that out and fill out a survey. And so that will help us understand what the interest is out there, but it'll also help us reach out to you if you're interested. So I'm going to leave that up for now and then see if people have some questions.
Okay, so we do have a bunch of questions. So the first question was, what are the incomes of the youth or families for the youth that are 16 or under?
The incomes of the families, it will range because the nature of problems for young people and families can happen across different income levels. One thing we do know though is that facing poverty can place additional pressures on family units, and so sometimes that can lead to family conflict and that kind of thing. Sometimes the support is to help the family get through a financial crisis that's leading to tension, that kind of thing. So so we don't want to suggest that homelessness or youth homelessness is purely a poverty problem, because it isn't. There are many things that can drive it, but poverty and crisis that comes from losing one's job or something like that can feed the tensions and challenges within a family.
Our next question is, will the slides be emailed out?
Absolutely. And yes, anytime people want to see the slides, that's absolutely fantastic. And then if you have questions about specific things in it, feel free to contact us.
Our email addresses are in the chat box as well, both for me and Steve. So if you do have questions, I can either field them to Steve or Steve can answer them directly. The next question was, can you show the education outcomes frame again? It was of number 4.
Okay. I'm going to go back into. Okay. So we're going down the commitment curve. Whoops, went too far. There it is.
Thank you so much. So another question is, was there mention of training available for family and natural supports education?
Absolutely. That's a big area of support where we have expertise on that. And as I was saying, it's the kind of thing that should be offered up to any young person who's in this situation, because as we know from research, but also experience, if you're working with young people experiencing homelessness, family conflict, things that happen in the family context, which can be kind of things you experienced or I experienced, it really is a key factor in what leads young people to leave home, either of their own choice or because they're kicked out. So we do have that. That's right. And A Way Home provides that. One of the things A Way Home provides that's a new thing that's fantastic is support for working with Indigenous youth. And that's something we really want to, emphasize, because that's important as well.
Another participant asked a question. They said, do you have youth homelessness data that focuses on mental health and addiction issues? In other words, the YMHA policymakers and programs benefit from your research?
Yeah, we have some research ourselves, but there's some pretty robust research out there. I mentioned Sean Kidd, and so we can make that kind of material available. And I think you're right. Like right now is a good time to be sharing that kind of information. And the mental health challenges can be, for a young person who experiences homelessness, it could be their own mental health challenges that are, making things difficult for them, but it could also be the mental health challenges of family members that put a lot of pressure on the lives of young people. The other thing that Sean Kidd talks about too is that when young people experience homelessness, there are some who come to this with trauma, having experienced trauma and mental health challenges, and others who haven't experienced trauma but may still have other challenges. But after a while, they level up. And it's because of the trauma that they experience while they are homeless. So, which again reinforces the idea that we need to give young people the supports as early as we can and make sure we can do whatever we can to help them not become homeless.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is, does any of the written information that you provided show how you engage the school boards? Curious about that process and how long it took to reconnect in the schools and surveys.
That's a fantastic question. It's something I love to talk about. It's something we're writing about now, because for the school-based early intervention programs, it's key, and schools can be challenging to engage. Sometimes I teach in a faculty of education and I have a course every summer on youth homelessness, and it's all practicing teachers. And most of them will say that they know young people that have been couch surfing or sleeping behind the school, that kind of thing. Sometimes they're supported internally. Sometimes there's pressure to not support the young person. It can come from the principal. It can come from the union. It can come from the school board. And so the challenge there is that I think we don't train people who work in schools to support young people or what to do in these situations. And so schools leadership can be nervous about this, right? Are we going to do the wrong thing? And so the best way to go in and engage with schools on these issues is to not go in and say, we want to talk with you about preventing homelessness, because they'll be like, that's not our mandate, and please don't give us one more thing to do. But if you go in and say, we're interested in student engagement, right? So student attachment to school. We're interested in student success. We're interested in student well-being. And we have ways of supporting young people that will enhance all those things so that they don't drop out, they don't become homeless, that kind of thing. And so there's ways of going in there, right? You need to build relationships with schools. And ideally, you need more than one champion in a school, right? Often it'll be the vice principal, but also maybe a teacher or a counselor. You need to build those champions in the school because staff move, right? And if you have like one supporter in the school, the principal or something, and then they get transferred, then you might lose the whole contact with the school. And so there's a lot of that relationship building that's there. And we've learned a lot about what to do and how to do that. And we're writing that up as a companion piece to basically address that. And we have people with experience dealing with those issues. We have principals who are like champions and will speak to like why this is such a good thing. But that's part of the work to make this happen. And when in talking to teachers, they'll go, when you explain it to them, they'll go, this is helpful. This would help us. And it can be seen not as a burden then, but as something that's for everyone. I could talk about that forever. That's a good question. Not that the other ones weren't great too.
So the next question is from somebody else, another different participant. Currently, our youth shelter stays tend to be quite lengthy. We have changed gears and are now providing youth who are being supported by CASNOG, a rental subsidy, to assist with keeping them housed while allowing the mandate agency to continue to provide the supports. Are other communities doing this?
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent, because you're providing the supports rather than just, like giving someone a subsidy may not be enough based on what we know about how people struggle when they exit homelessness. So I think that's a good model. Like, I think there's all kinds of ways about thinking about, the crisis response in ways that focus more on getting people housed or help people not have a long stay in the shelter. That when I gave the definition of homelessness, or of homelessness, youth homelessness prevention, that second one about stopping people from transitioning to chronic homelessness is really key, right? And so we have to get in there early and support organizations to do this kind of work before the real challenges emerge. You know, like every chronically homeless person who is 50 right now and very sick was homeless for the first time once. At some point in their life, they had their first experience of homelessness. And if you can imagine how their life might have been different if we'd reoriented the approach and provided supports, helped people exit homelessness, their lives could have turned out very differently. And so, you know, again, that we know that 50% of all people experiencing homelessness had their first experience before 24. That's a big signal about where we should be putting our efforts.
Amazing. The next question is, what about youth within the correctional services or who may be in conflict with the law? Is there any specific supports for them?
It depends on the jurisdiction, right? So different communities have different things. In some cases, it's community-based supports. There's this program in the northwest of Toronto where what they do is they're connecting with young people while they're in prison, and before as they do some transitional planning for them. And so one of the things they'll do is they'll say, we want to put together a support team for you when you leave here, like have maybe 4 adults who you choose who could be on that team and help you navigate, you know, re-entering the community, all that kind of thing. And young people will say, oh, my grandma, that would be great. Or they might say, I had this really cool teacher when I was in grade 5 or grade 6, and I'd like that person to be on the team. And what's really cool about that program is that usually the adults step up, right? It might be like, I haven't seen that young person for 8 years, but I remember them. Yes, I'll be on the team. And so those kind of community-based approaches that build and enhance family and natural supports can be key to re-entry. There's other things in Canadian law that are in some cases helpful. So in the Youth Criminal Justice Act, they have this notion of diversion, which is that police services should try to give young people alternatives to being arrested and going on trial. And so that means that police need to be engaged, that you need like a connection to community organizations that can help people. And I know it's very uneven in Canada, like police services don't always follow that requirement. But there are some places like in Edmonton, they're doing some really cool work in that area with the Edmonton Police Services, and I believe in Calgary as well. So those are really good examples of trying to work before young people wind up entrenched in that kind of life, and have helped them avoid going to prison. But those kind of engagement and diversion programs are for youth, right? So under 18. It's too bad that we don't have that as like statutory responsibility for young people 18 to 25 involved in the criminal justice system. So you'll see like interesting approaches here and there that other people could learn from. But I would say these things aren't widespread.
So another participant asked, she said that you mentioned a program in Kelowna. What is it?
It's run by the Boys and Girls Clubs of Kelowna, and it's the Upstream project. So they've kind of worked on all those things, like how do we engage with the schools, how do we engage with young people. It's a really good example of how to do this kind of work, and that's an area where we can do training and technical assistance on too, like how do you implement it, and how do you do all this work with getting the schools involved, and how do you assess young people, all of these kinds of things. So there are some really good examples out there, and in Australia they've been working to take it to scale so that it's in as many communities as possible.
Somebody else asked, if community partners are interested in connecting further to discuss their commitment, how do they get in touch?
You can I think Emma put her email and my email in the mail or in the chat. if that's hard to track down, you can go on to the Homeless Hub website, and I believe there's a way to contact. Or if you Google me and go to my Faculty of Education webpage, there'll be my address there. But we'd love to hear from you and everyone who's interested in these things.
So another question we had was, how might duty to assist / rights-based approaches, frameworks relate to some of the issues we saw with encampments during the pandemic?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Imagine what it would look like. Or so first of all, I want to say that people make the decision to stay in a tent instead of go in a shelter. Like, we have to respect and understand people's choices. But imagine if we had in place a way of saying, when someone shows up, offering them the help, that duty to assist kind of piece. You can see how that would complement that. Like, we can help you, get a different kind of solution and see how that would work. It's rights-based. It's also driven by the person, so they can accept help or choose that not to, right? It respects people need to be in charge of their own destinies as much as anybody is really in charge of their own destiny. So I think that, that would be the kind of thing that would have been really cool to see implemented broadly, but here we are now. So, it's the kind of thing I think that can work in any of these circumstances.
Our next question is, what's the age range typically used for youth homelessness and the rationale for it? They said, we serve families in from the cold in Calgary, meaning that about 25% may be considered part of youth homelessness.
Right. It varies based on region, but also organizational mandate. So in a given community, like Calgary, it might be that the different services have different age mandates. Calgary's unique in Canada because, organizations like Trellis define youth homelessness from 13 to like 24. But it could be in one community that one organization serves people from 16 to 19 or something, and another one's from 21 to 25. Generally, though, there are very few examples. I just mentioned one in Calgary, but very few examples where communities actually see people who are under 16. And so with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, we released a definition of youth homelessness several years ago that basically said it's young people who are unattached but have no prospect of getting housed in the immediate future that are between 13 and 24 years old. Both of the ends of that definition are arbitrary, like it always is if you have age cutoffs. But the idea was to really highlight that we can't ignore the young people who are shut out from the homelessness infrastructure in our communities. Sometimes people have the age mandate for youth go up to 29. I'm not bothered by that. I think that, you have to understand too that in terms of development, people are at different stages. Not all 16-year-olds are at the same developmental stage. Not all 19-year-olds, not all 25-year-olds. So I don't have a problem with people expanding it up. I do think that we need to make sure that in our communities, we recognize the young people who are under 16 and that they could be facing problems and figure out how to help them, right? Because you think of the wasted opportunity if there's a 13 or 14-year-old who can't get help, right, or appropriate help, and has to wait. And what's going to happen while they're waiting? What's going to happen in their lives while they wait until they're 16? And then if they're just offered emergency services but no prospect of resolving the issue, you can kind of see that that if we did things differently, we could change a lot of lives in really positive ways. And if we don't do things differently, are we really contributing to their eventual chronicity?
Okay, so on to our next question. They said, have you worked with public libraries at all in your research? I'm interested particularly with public libraries. If not, I'd be interested in talking to you about this. I think libraries could be actively involved in the duty to assist,
You're
especially since
absolutely right. I have to change my slides. You're that's a really good point. I haven't done research on it, but I've done a lot of engagement in different places in Canada. And libraries are, like, in many communities, very supportive of people experiencing homelessness. And I think you're absolutely right. They would be a key player in that whole duty to assist piece. And yeah, I don't know why I haven't thought of that before. Thank you for suggesting that.
So our next question is, like in Wales in South Africa, our constitution empowers local municipalities to assist the at risk of becoming homeless individuals. Yet municipalities fail constantly. Fail and constantly have to be taken to court, especially when private developers are involved. They use loopholes to fund alternative accommodations where people are uprooted from their livelihoods, schools, supports, and structures.
I think, yeah, I don't know the details in South Africa. I think that it's why we have to really think about what does a rights-based approach mean, and how can it be actualized, and what are the mechanisms to see that people's rights are protected. Canada has a right to housing. We're taking an approach of progressive realization of that right. So over time it'll improve and improve, but you have to have the systems to be accountable and, be able to stop these kind of workarounds that put people in jeopardy. It has to be justiciable, which means that a person whose rights have been violated can sue, right? These kind of things with, get supports to do that kind of thing. And you have to make sure things are universal, right? You can't say housing is a right, but it's a right for some people and not everybody. It's, and so these kind of things work out in complex ways. In Wales, even the implementation of the Housing Wales Act, the on-the-ground implementation was not consistent across the country. So some communities were doing a great job and the numbers were driving down. And you have to be careful in terms of accountability, because what you could have is, if you have the requirement that someone must take reasonable steps to help someone, you have to make sure that they're actually reasonable and real steps, not, there are ways that in many public systems, things can be designed or people can practice in ways that basically undermine the whole concept, right? So you could imagine offering someone assistance, but it being such a terrible offer that the person would say, actually, no, I don't want that help, right? So keeping systems accountable is a big part of the right to housing. It's not an easy part, but it has to be there. You can't just have a right to housing in name only. And I think in Canada, one of the things we're looking forward to is like talking about, like, what does a right to housing mean for somebody who's under 18? Because my view is that the right to housing is often, the rights holder is often conceptualized as an adult. And what if we built, what does the right to housing mean for a 16-year-old? What does it mean for a 13-year-old? Right? Right to housing for a 13-year-old might mean that we shore up their family to make sure the young person can stay housed there. That's a very different way of thinking about what a right is and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to hear what happens in other countries. I'd say that, as I mentioned, many public systems, there can be individuals who work to undermine the whole purpose of that right or that system. And so we have to fight that and figure out ways of exposing it and addressing it.
Our next question is about duty to assist. The participant asks, how does duty to assist apply when there is a shortage of housing and access to services?
There's we live in a period where in most places there's a shortage of affordable housing. And so the duty to assist can mean that somebody might be facing eviction, and that they get some support on their arrears, or plus other kinds of supports, that kind of thing. And so there's a cost there, but the reality is if you let someone become evicted and wind up homeless, their ability to transition back into housing is going to be more expensive, right? Because the cost of rental housing goes up for new housing that's available. And it's usually higher than what the person had in the first place. So I think one of the interesting things to consider is that keeping people in a state of homelessness is really, really expensive. The cost of public systems of keeping people homeless is huge. And it doesn't just mean the cost to the homelessness sector, right? So we have the provision of services and the cost of, per bed of keeping someone homeless is significant. But we also know that when people experience homelessness, they're more likely to have encounters with the police that lead to them being incarcerated. A prison cell is the most expensive form of housing that there is. And then with healthcare, we know that when people experience homelessness, their health tends to be under pressure and decline, whether it's mental health and experiencing trauma or physical health. And so there's more utilization of health services, including, people going in through the emergency room, which is the most expensive gateway. And so there's been research done on this. The best study I've seen was done by Eric Latimer, who's an economist at McGill. And he looked at the 5 cities that were part of At Home Chiswa. So it was Vancouver, Edmonton, I believe, Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton. And for the city of Toronto, he calculated that per year, the cost of keeping someone homeless is $59,000, right? And so that's the cost of the justice system piece. That's the cost of healthcare. That's the cost of the emergency services. And so with $59,000, if you were able to turn that into cash, you would be able to get that person housed, plus give them supports they need. And so we see the cost of housing and, getting people housed as a barrier, which it is. But we don't talk enough about how costly it is to keep people in a state of homelessness. And it's costly. It's a cost that accrues over time, because the longer someone is homeless, the sicker they become, the more they're exposed to trauma and problems that become very expensive to deal with down the road, right? So if we could avoid all of that and intervene early, yes, there will be costs, but it's a matter of where do we invest our dollars and why. We're in a wealthy society. And country like Wales has shown that they can drive down their homelessness numbers through duty to assist. And, housing isn't cheap there either, right? So it's a matter of where we ask our government to spend its money and make the case. Like, as I said, there's research that shows it's so expensive and wasteful to keep people in that state. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it reflects my view that, if we want to, if we choose to, as a society, we can do things very differently and give people the support they need. Yes, it'll cost money, and for some people it will be very expensive because of their health needs and that kind of thing. But it's going to be better outcomes for everyone.
All right, so being mindful of the time, I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Great.
So the next question is, how may we find out what kind of preventative work may already be in place in our cities?
Oh, that's a good question. One of we've been thinking about how to find that out. And so we know in a very anecdotal way about what's going on. But the survey I mentioned and that Emma put the link for is one way that we're going to help gather data on that, because we're asking people about their interest in these things, but also in their community, are there interesting preventive interventions? And so over time, we'll be gathering information on this. We'll also be, by the way, I mentioned earlier, the 39 research projects that we're funding. We're going to learn more through those projects where the interesting things are. There's likely a lot of interesting things going on, but the challenge is that innovation often stays really close to the ground, because organizations aren't funded to like write reports that are public facing or to evaluate their programs in that way. But there's, all of the preventive interventions that we know, were created by somebody for the first time, and it may have taken a long time before others became aware of it. So one of the things we will be doing is like really trying to paint a picture and create ways that people can engage in learning about these things.
So our next question is on one of the slides you mentioned the quality of life measures and resilience measures. They would be interested in understanding how those factors are assessed. They asked, is it something like the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix, or is there a better way of measuring client outcomes related to quality of life or resilience?
The resilience measure we use is the R14, which has 4 questions. All of the measures that we're using, or most of them, are validated measures, and that we had our team of researchers decide which one to use. And so the way that they work is that there are ways of analyzing the data that come with the measure. I'm not enough of an expert on these kind of quantitative methods to be able to describe it any more than that, but there's kind of like an approach. If you use this measure, it has 20 questions, and depending on the score on each question, if it adds up to such and such a number, this is what it says about resilience or quality of life, that kind of thing. But it's important that they're validated measures, because there's often a lot of pseudoscientific stuff out there that is problematic.
Okay, so our last question for today is, as youth stay in shelters longer, I've noticed more street entrenchment and trauma the longer that youth stay. What supports can be provided to rapidly support and address this issue in younger, more vulnerable people that may already exist in the world, offer wraparound supports, or how can we create that in our community?
I'd say 2 things. One is the interventions that we talked about here, like Youth Reconnect and FNS and school-based stuff. There are other early intervention approaches, shelter diversion, these kinds of things. If you make it the focus of your organization to make sure young people don't become entrenched, that's how you're going to be helping them, right? But at the same time, we have young people who are entrenched now, or who, even with those preventive interventions, are going to become entrenched. And so what I would say there is housing first for youth, right? And there are some other housing-led approaches that have good wraparound support models. And so like these are things that we know work, and you can adapt for subpopulations, that kind of thing. So we want to be able to, again, stop people from entering homelessness and stop them from becoming chronically homeless and entrenched. But we also want to help people exit homelessness with the right kind of wraparound support so they don't return to homelessness. And that's not always easy work. I wouldn't say that necessarily, but it's important work, and we owe it to people. Nobody deserves that fate.
think we actually might have time for one more quick question,
A bonus question,
a bonus question.
the bonus round.
And then we can wrap up for today. So the last question is, the real last question is, one of the challenges is that many community programs exist, which would fit the criteria mentioned today, but they may not identify as homelessness prevention for youth. It would be ideal to be able to understand which ones fit under this criteria with a main focus on homelessness prevention and a secondary criteria that meets the elements provided, but their goal might be something else.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of community programs that don't necessarily have as their mandate to prevent youth homelessness, but may be doing it anyway. So it becomes a challenge to tease it out, because how do we know that the young people in that program are at risk of homelessness? Because the characteristics of people who become homeless, experience homelessness, can be very similar to other people who don't, but may still be experiencing poverty or family conflict, that kind of thing. And so we have to be careful to make sure that we're able to, like, is this the real thing? But having said that, I would also say we strongly believe that the responsibility for addressing homelessness can't just rest on the homelessness sector or programs that focus just on homeless people. Like, we have to get better at supporting young people leaving care, right? And that's not necessarily the homelessness sector's job. We have to get better on helping. The question was, young people exiting prison, right? These are important support programs that are community-based, but will have a potential impact on reducing return to homelessness, these kind of things. So we need, like, different public systems involved. We need different kinds of community programs involved. And I think with a strong focus on well-being, would probably have good impact on things. But we also need those crisis supports to, when people do become homeless, but have them, like, oriented to helping them exit homelessness as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar today, and thank you for the presentation, Steve, and for answering all those questions.
No problem.